All right, so what we're going to look at today, continuing our discussion on Great Britain, is we're going to be looking at citizen society and the state. So one of the things that we have to look at with the United Kingdom is the idea that they are multinational. All right, the UK evolved from 4 different nations: England, Wales, Scotland, and part of Ireland, so Northern Ireland. This bringing together of many nations to create one country is the root of many of the conflicts throughout the country. Each of these regions still look at themselves as being independent ideas, and there's a lot of history between how they feel about each other. England being a dominant feature, that sometimes Wales, Scotland, and Ireland feel very apprehensive about the power that they have over them. All right, England is the largest region of Great Britain and contains the largest population. The British currently have a larger proportion of power throughout the UK than do the other entities. The British Parliament is what really rules over over all 4 of those concepts. All right, Wales is west of England, and it became subject to the English in the 16th century. The Welsh are proud of their language, and they're proud that it's still taught in their schools, and they still feel some resentment towards England's rule. They have their own national flag. It's called the Plaid Cymru, and that's actually a political party that also exists through Wales as well. Now, Scotland. Scotland joined Britain due to an intermarriage of families in the 17th century. This is despite years of refusing to yield to Britain. Scots still think of themselves as being very different than the British and display their pride with their own national flag and Scottish Parliament. So let's think about this. Let's go back to our first unit where we talked about the difference between nations, states, and countries, and nation-states and things like that. So we can look at Scotland as being a nation, but they're not necessarily their own state. So we look at that idea as that they have this nationalistic concept, but they aren't their own independent country. All right, religious issues. So Northern Ireland. Religious issues have existed between England and Ireland for centuries. All right, after World War I, Ireland was granted the right of home rule, except for the northeast corner where Protestants outnumbered Catholics. All right, so there's this historical conflict that goes on between Catholicism, between Protestantism, and it gets very, very ugly. So the Irish Republican Army, they used guerrilla warfare tactics to convince the British to allow Irish independence. There's a lot of fighting, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of really nasty things that go on over whether or not Protestantism should be followed or whether or not Catholicism should be followed. So in 1949, Ireland was allowed total independence except for the northeast section. And the reason that the northeast section is not part of that is because they are largely Protestant, and they wanted to stay with the UK. So when we look at social classes today, the most important classes are the working class and the middle class. These 2 classes are not easily divided by income, but are more psychological and subjective. It's not like where we look at it in the United States, where we have a very distinct idea of what the lower class is, or what the poverty level class is. We have a very distinct idea of what middle class is, and we have a very distinct idea of what upper class is, and we have a very good idea of that based upon education, based upon income level and things like that. But it's very much a psychological concept within the UK. The working class is more focused on keeping the old job, living the old neighborhood, and keeping close to family and friends, where the middle class, what we would consider the middle class they're looking at moving up within society. They're looking at trying to make more money. They're looking at trying to get better jobs. And they're not as tied to the neighborhood as what we would consider the working class to be. The school system also reinforces the class system within England. The private and upper class schools train middle class students to take over elite positions in government and society. That's the purpose of what they're there for. They're prep schools. Where if you look at working class schools, they're very much buy into that idea of you stay in the neighborhood and you do the types of jobs that everybody has always done in those neighborhoods. When we look at the idea of ethnic minorities within Great Britain, as of 2001, and this is a little bit of an outdated number, but as of 2001, only about 7.1% of the British population was of non-European origin. The largest ethnic groups included Indian, Pakistani, Afro-Caribbean, and then Black African. So when we look at that idea, Britain is very, very, very culturally homogenous. Because there's not a lot of outside influence, the people that largely, the large part of the British population have been there for generation after generation after generation. So the things that are going on within that country have really strong historical roots. And there's not a lot of things that have existed in order to knock them off of those traditional concepts. Because of past immigration restrictions, most ethnic minorities are young. The increase in ethnic minorities have caused issues throughout England. In 2001, there were race riots. Issues with the Muslim population arose after 9/11 in 2001, and in 2011, there were another round of race riots. So there have been some ethnic tensions and things like that that have existed throughout the UK, but largely because of the cultural homogeneity that exists, there's not a lot of racial tensions and things like that that exist within the country. When we do look at the Muslim population, and that is a growing population within the UK, there have been lots of things that have led to some of the distrust that exists, some of the social issues that exist between the Christian white population and the Muslim population within the UK. And part of it has to do with 9/11, the 9/11 attacks in the United States, because there is a very strong tie relationship between the United States and the UK. There were also attacks that actually took place in Great Britain. There was the 7/7/7 attack, which had to do with different bombs that had been placed throughout London. There were car bombings, there are bus bombings. There were bombings that took place in what they call the Tube, which is their subway system. So there's lots of different things that have gone on that have kind of caused some of these issues. And there are some other factors that go. Muslims are a distinct minority throughout Britain because there are so few of them. People are kind of hyper aware when they see Muslims within the country. There are high levels of unemployment and poverty amongst Muslim citizens. So there is that negative viewpoint because they're looked at as being leeches on the system. So there are some negative perspective issues there. There's a high level of Pakistani Muslims, and they are felt to have stronger ties to Al-Qaeda because of the fact that Al-Qaeda memberships and things like that and the training grounds that existed within Pakistan. So there's that strong tie. The British supported the Iraq War, especially very early on in the war. They became very unhappy with the Iraq War as it continued on, which, as we talked about in the previous lesson, is why Tony Blair kind of lost his popularity throughout the country. But especially that early support of the Iraqi war kind of pushed a lot of this distrust. And because there's a lack of minority integration within the country, because groups very much tend to stay to themselves, there's been a lot of issues there as well. When we look at political values throughout Britain, British civic culture is characterized by trust, deference to authority and competence, pragmatism, and harmony. So when we look at those ideas, they trust the government to do the things that they're supposed to do. They trust that the government is doing the right things. They feel that there's a high level of transparency and that there's not a lot of distrust to be had. Deference to authority and competence means that they're very willing to allow people with authority who they feel are competent to just do their job. They're not down their throats all the time. They're not trying to force them to do specific types of things. But the idea is if you put the right people in office, then you let them run the country. They're very pragmatic, which means that they like to think about things on both sides of the issue, rather than being so stuck on one political concept or the other. We tend to look at British culture as being very pragmatic, that they're willing to look at things through both sides and then make decisions based upon reason rather than on emotion. And there's a lot of harmony. There's not a lot of discord throughout the UK. There are high percentages of people who vote. They accept authority, they have tolerance for different viewpoints, and they accept the rules of the game. This is even despite economic crisis and recent rioting. Alright, so when we look at other things with political values, there has been a decrease in support of labor unions. Strikes during the 1970s helped change the view of unions, and they began to be viewed as bullies rather than as people who helped the working class. Increased violence regarding Northern Ireland has changed political values and political structure. Religious conflict escalated in the 1970s with Bloody Sunday, in which 13 Catholics were killed. Religious conflict exists even now, so there's still that religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics. Thatcherism is a huge political value, that going back to that neoliberalism idea, that this was the push by Margaret Thatcher to move towards a free market economy and away from social welfare programs. Then we've got New Labour again, which we talked about in our previous lesson, and this idea of being able to move in that third way in between what Old Labour wanted and what the Conservatives wanted. And then we got the protests over the Iraq War, in which we talked about before how Blair lost his support over of his U.S. support, that he lost support because people were unwilling to support what was going on in Iraq. When we look at voting behavior in the UK, normally more than 70% of eligible citizens actually show up to vote. There is less party loyalty than in the past, but voting behavior is largely based upon social class and region. And we're going to look at that a little bit more when we actually look in depth at the types of political parties that exist. But region and social class have a huge impact on who you vote for, but even within that, the party loyalty is starting to be a little bit less as we move throughout time. Social class, traditionally the working class has supported the Labour Party, and the middle class has voted the Conservative. This has been blurred by the parties moving more to the center. So as the parties become less extreme, as they move more to that center concept of what we think about political spectrum, it's been harder for people to choose one party over the other. And then we look at regional factors. The Labour Party usually does well in urban and industrial areas and in Scotland and Wales, and Conservatives usually win in England's rural and suburban areas.